Hey everyone, Andrew Mayne here, and today I want to talk about Arthur C. Clarke. Today is his birthday. He was born on December 16th in 1917. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago, but his legacy stays with us today. And I think every day I think about something to work on a project relating to an idea that I got from reading him. For those who aren't familiar with Arthur C. Clarke, you've probably heard of one of his most famous works, which is the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, which Stanley Kubrick used the story The Sentinel, written by Arthur C. Clarke, and expanded that into the film and collaborated with Arthur C. Clarke on it. You see him here on the set of that. And that movie, very much Stanley Kubrick in many elements, but the themes were very much Arthur C. Clarke. This was the intersection of science, technology, and humanity. This is one of the first introductions to artificial intelligence. And I think it just is a really good entry point to the kinds of things he liked to think about and he liked to talk about. Now, some of his contributions are outside of just the field of science fiction. He was an incredible futurist. He described a lot of the ways that technology could play out in a very accurate way: email, the internet, etc. He was writing about this way before anybody understood these concepts. And besides just writing cool science fiction stories, he was very much into space. And he contributed ideas like this. This is the geostationary satellite. Now, the significance of this was he realized that in order to have communications, you could, instead of just having a satellite pass over, every 45 minutes as it tries to stay in orbit, you could put it in a much more distant orbit, about 22,000 miles away, and it would effectively stay over the same region. Why is this significant? Well, if you want to have broadcast television from a satellite, it's not helpful if every 45 minutes that satellite goes out of view. But if it's always constantly there, you can bounce your signals up and down from there. You can have communications. You can do a lot of things with just one satellite staying over one region. And he thought about this, he wrote about this, and this became a reality less than like 2 decades later. So he had many ideas like this. And so he contributed things both to the world of science and to science fiction. And his ideas in science fiction actually helped influence the way young people who became scientists thought about the world. Childhood's End is a really cool story. It was made into a TV movie a while ago. I don't know if it worked for most people, but the premise of it's really cool, and that's something worth checking out. Another idea that he talked a lot about or inspired people was the idea of a space elevator. He wrote about this in a story called The Fountains of Paradise. Now, the space elevator was an idea that existed well before. It's like a 19th century idea that if you had a tether going from the Earth to a ballast point far enough away that it would stay basically effectively in space, and you could just use an elevator to go up and down from the Earth's surface to space. It's crazy, but the physics works out. You just have to figure out your materials. And I think the space elevator, I liked it as a kid. I thought it was cool. And then as I looked at the pace of reusable rockets like the Starship, et cetera, I don't think it makes as much sense now, but it's a really cool concept. And I think that's one of the important things about science fiction is just giving us things that are bigger or more imaginative than what we're familiar with to think about. He also wrote, like Ronnie with Rama is just a really cool science fiction story. It's one of my favorite books about what it would be like to contact aliens or to be in the presence of an alien species to an extent. I don't want to give up too much about the plot. I highly recommend it. There have been attempts to turn this into a film or make a great series. We'll see. I think it's a really cool book, and I recommend that. He's got a lot of collections that if you want to read his science fiction stories, you can take a look at. One of my favorite ones is the Collected Stories, which is available on Audible, which is something like 20 hours of short stories, including ones from a collection called Tales from the White Heart. Tales from White Heart's cool. It's basically people in this sort of English club talking about different science fiction mysteries or stories. So basically, it's taking a science fiction story and wrapping it around a format called a club tale, which was popular for a while. Isaac Asimov did that with his mysteries. He had a mystery series with its own club, and there was sort of a format that existed before. And then I'm reading Tales from, what am I reading right now? Draco Tavern by Larry Niven. So it's a really neat format. But anyhow, I recommend that. But again, if you're going to start somewhere, 9 Billion Names of God, I really, really recommend that. So I never had the chance to meet Arthur C. Clarke, although the man I worked for, James Randi, I worked for his educational foundation, which promoted critical thinking and science literacy. Randy was really good friends with Arthur C. Clarke, and they would, talk on the phone. One of the things that I thought was really fascinating was Arthur was an avid scuba diver. He was an explorer. He actually discovered like shipwrecks and temples around Sri Lanka. And he had a condition from basically polio related where he started to lose, some of his mobility, which meant he was confined to a wheelchair. But even up until his later years, he could still get into the water and he could still swim and kind of experience weightlessness. He always wanted to go to space, but being a scuba diver was the second best thing for him. And that was something he enjoyed up until, I think almost to the point that he passed away. So at least he had that, which is kind of awesome. And also he did a lot of really cool things as an underwater explorer. He also, was a person that just liked to have this enthusiasm for where things could be, what technology could mean. And, some not pessimistic, but very positive. I mean, he could, be concerned about some of the implications of this. He worried very much about nuclear war. These are themes he, throughout his books. But you read his books and you understand this sort of positive view of the world. And one of my favorite books that he wrote of all is the book Profiles of the Future. And what is Profiles of the Future? Well, the original version of this came out like 1960, and it's a collection of essays about what the future could be like. And as a futurist, he was a person that people went to say, hey, what is the world going to be like? What do you think? And he was a person that had predicted successfully a number of things. And I think that's a key point here. There's no shortage of people with opinions about what the future will be like. The question you have to ask them is, how accurate have they been in the past? And I think that's a good indicator for how accurate they'll be in the future. And I think that some of the loudest voices have no track record of being accurate, whereas Arthur C. Clarke, for a guy that basically predicted the internet, predicted email, how satellite communications would work, it's worth reading. And he will admit where he's wrong. And so this book was great because he would do later editions of it and say, hey, back then I thought this was going to happen. And he was really big on hovercraft. He thought hovercrafts were going to be the way that we would travel in the future. And then he actually got to drive a hovercraft and find out that this was not exactly easy to control. And he had an accident with a hovercraft in the later edition of the book. He's like, yeah, maybe not so much the hovercraft, but other things he was just spot on about. Now, when I worked at OpenAI, this was a book recommended that we read by Sam Altman. Sam was a very big fan of this book, and understandably so if you read it. And we arranged with Arthur C. Clarke's estate to actually do a reprint of the book, which we give to every employee at OpenAI. And I had the pleasure of working on putting together this edition. Now, I want to talk about things that he had. He had like here a whole timeline of the future of things that he thought like when things might come to be, when they might happen. And it wasn't meant to be like a real serious, hey, I'm going to predict the future, but it was sort of a futurist sort of saying, at what point do I think these things are going to happen? Let me see if I can find that here. Really not too critical if I do or don't. But I also want to explain something that he talked about that really got me thinking. Now, in putting this book together, I had to go through all sorts of examples of that. But here's an example. He talks about a section called The Quest for Speed. And he gets into how fast things get, how fast you have to be to kind of, visit nearby stars, et cetera. Whole table of velocities, et cetera, which is an example of what I loved about his writing was that it wasn't just, a lot of science fiction or what passes for science fiction today is kind of just, it's fantasy where you just replace magic with somebody saying quantum and people go, oh, okay, that sounds scientific, which that's fine. That could be entertaining. I mean, that's what makes Star Trek fun and Star Wars fun is they're not really science fiction. They feel ostensibly on the surface like they are, but they're fantasy, and fantasy has its role and can make for very interesting stories. So let me go through here. There was a example he went in here and he talked about the idea of what happens when you can compress time or what happens when you can make things smaller. And this was a really interesting idea of if you think about making things smaller, what happens? And this is something that Richard Feynman talked about. He did a lecture, kind of a famous lecture called There's Plenty of Room Down at the Bottom. And that was exploring in, I think, like the late 60s, the idea of what happens if you keep shrinking things down. How small can you make a thing, which eventually became what we did with microcomputers. As we realized the microprocessor could be made smaller and smaller, it meant that you could put more and more of them, get more power out of it. What happens with other things? What happens when you can shrink certain kinds of mechanical devices? What happens when you're able to reduce the size of these things, the footprint something needs? A lot of interesting things happen. What happens when you increase the amount of energy? Interesting idea too. But something that really stuck with me was he talked about what happens if you can expand time or compress time? What if you could learn, something that would have taken you a week, what if you could learn it in an hour? What if you could do that? And that really had me thinking, reading his essay talking about how you would try to approach this and different ways to thinking about that. And that got me into studying a lot of different things. Like right now, I've been big into memory methods. I have a bookshelf full of that, trying to think of like what are more efficient ways to memorize stuff. Uh, Fortunately, we live in an age of YouTube, so we know things now about spaced repetition. It's very easy to find out about that. I started getting into rapid serial visual presentation, which is the idea of rapidly presenting text in front of your eyes to see how fast you could read. And there are questions there about how much you can actually learn and retain later on. But that was just an interesting idea that made me think, how can I use my time more efficiently? So I've been spending just a lot of time thinking about that and actually working on applications and studying different methods. One of the things that came out of this was I was thinking about the whole concept of rapid serial visual presentation, which I just mentioned, which was an idea that's been around for decades. And there was actually research into the set in the 1970s about this, in the 1980s, some very interesting studies showing how fast can you present text before you have a drop off. About a decade ago, there were some apps that came out online that kind of present themselves as being new ideas about this, but they were actually more just marketed versions of older ideas. So as a project, I made this thing. It's actually, you can check it out. It's wikispeeder.com. This was based upon reading that section about what happens if you can compress time. And I was trying to think about what happens if I can basically change the rate at which you present text. So this is just a fast way to read Wikipedia. I don't know if it's a good way, but this was just a fun experiment. So like here, we take Arthur C. Clarke's bio from Wikipedia and we present it at right now 566 words per minute. Now, you might find that it takes practice at first to be able to understand it, but at 335 words per minute, which is a higher range of reading, it's pretty usable. Now, one of the ways of using RSVP was to use one word at a time. I looked at the methods and realized if you chunked it into groups of words, like 2 or 3 words at a time, you could actually process it and read it even faster. And I played with different algorithms for improving this, and I've got several of them, but basically just wanted to show you here what happens when you do this. This is just a project that came about after reading his essay talking about how you could compress time. And this app, the way it works here is that after you finish something, you can then click on something there. So now I get the summary of Rendezvous with Rama, which I don't spoil it for you. And so this was just fun. He wrote an essay suggesting something interesting, and I started to think about it and wonder, what happens next. So he's got an incredible legacy. I highly recommend that you check out a short story or something by Arthur C. Clarke. Who knows? It might have you thinking and thinking for several years later about that concept. Anyhow, that's just a little bit about Arthur C. Clarke. Thank you for watching. See you soon.